are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Tuesday, July 2nd, 2019. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Professor of Psychology, Stanford University, Jennifer Eberhardt, Unbiased, uncovering the hidden prejudice that shapes what we see, think, and do. Also on the program today, Trump will get his tanks for his corrupt July 4th celebration. Bill Barr now given more say over the immigration courts. Meanwhile, an investigation launches into the 10,000 custom border agents who are all on a racist Facebook group. Meanwhile, a Honduran immigrant dies in ICE facility in Texas, while others tell congresspeople they are forced to drink from toilets. Back at Capitol Hill, Democrats sue, finally, to get Donald Trump's tax returns. Bernie Sanders raises $18 million in small donations in Q2. And lastly, Think Progress is for sale. All this and more on today's program. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Tuesday episode of the Majority Report on this abbreviated week. We will not have a show on July 4th. Maybe we'll just have release audio of tanks rolling down the streets. You'll recall that Donald Trump has wanted to have tanks, I think, at his inauguration, and then subsequent July 4th celebrations, because he became enamored with the idea of large military shows of strength and missiles and whatnot that he saw the North Koreans do, and maybe, I think, for Bastille Day. And he wants all sorts of toys and people saluting at me. The other thing to keep in mind with this celebration on July 4th is that they are now using it as a mechanism to drive fundraising for the Republicans. Now, many of you are probably too young to remember Lincoln's bedroom. But Lincoln's bedroom became popularized by the right, I think it was in the 90s now, because Bill Clinton, some of Bill Clinton's top donors, spent a night in the Lincoln bedroom at the White House.
How's it feel?
And they were allowed to come in. In this instance, basically, tickets are being sold for the sake of Republican donors directly. There's no sort of, you're a big campaign contributor, come to the White House and visit me. It's come to this celebration for money, and only for money that will go into Republican hands. Literally leveraging an event, creating an event with tax dollars. Incidentally, well, we'll talk more about this after we hear Donald Trump make an announcement, I guess, about what's going to happen on the 4th.
tanks out on 4th of July at the Lincoln Memorial for your speech?
We're going to have a great 4th of July in Washington, D.C. It'll be like no other. It'll be special, and I hope a lot of people come, and it's going to be about this country, and it's a salute to America. And I'm going to be here, and I'm going to say a few words, and we're going to have planes going overhead, the best fighter jets in the world, and other planes too. And we're going to have some tanks stationed outside. Got to be pretty careful with the tanks because the roads have a tendency not to like to carry heavy tanks, so we have to put them in certain areas. But we have the brand new Sherman tanks, so we have the brand new Abram tanks, and we have some incredible equipment, military equipment on display, brand new, and we're very proud of it. You know, we're making a lot of new tanks right now. We're building a lot of new tanks in Lima, Ohio. A great tank factory that people wanted to close down until I got elected, and I stopped it from being closed down. And now it's a very productive facility. They do the greatest tank in the world.
Now, the idea of us getting into a massive land war that's going to require whole new fleets of tanks is pretty hard to imagine. But at least we've got a lot of them, and now we can show them off at parades. And just in case you were wondering about this July 4th celebration, it's going to be a lot about America. One of the things,
in
too...
contrast to other July 4th celebrations.
Right.
Apologizing for America.
First of all, I'm sorry. All right, now go make your hot dogs, you white devils.
The Parks Department is getting charged for transporting the tanks by the military. You know, the Parks Department that's already hurting for funding. It's just, it's grotesque and slightly reminiscent of this.
A truck! Oh boy, oh boy. Oh boy, oh boy. Truck. Honk, honk goes the truck.
There you go. Honk, honk goes the truck. Anthony Adamrick. Still almost as Trump as Trump. But, I mean, this is welcome to the new America. And I just don't, I know there's going to be a ton of people who are going to be out there psyched to see those tanks. I don't know why we don't have missiles, too.
Why are you sharing ideas?
I mean, why not?
I mean, look, if you look at those incredible North Korean and People's Liberation Army parades, they have missiles. Trump should be in fatigues standing out of a limo.
That would be amazing to watch. I would also, maybe
especially
what we
if
should also
keep his balance,
flatbed with some charred bodies, just to show like the handiwork of the tanks.
Speaking of which.
But I guess we don't get that to the second term of Trump. Meanwhile,
you fly some bodies back in of any places across the world that were killing people.
Meanwhile, several congresswomen went down to and men went to tour some facilities. There's a lot happening on the migrant concentration camp front. We will talk more about this big ProPublica story from yesterday that basically uncovers a customs and border protection, I guess, Facebook group made up of former and existing border agents who trade racist memes and mock dead immigrants, as well as those in Congress who may be supportive of immigrants not being abused in these camps. Here's an image of one of the camps from above. I mean, I don't know where is this one, Brendan? This one is McAllen, Texas, in May 2015. We've reported that the Department of Homeland Security apparently was afraid at that time of potential riots. I mean, you look at this, it's not terribly surprising. That's just extraordinary. These images are, frankly, you know what they're reminiscent of is New Orleans after Katrina. People living in the stadium there. But this is not obviously a natural disaster. It's a man-made one. There is a surge of immigrants coming in. These detention centers, as they're calling them, were not designed to hold people for extended periods of time, but they have created the circumstance why they have this backlog of people in these places. And it came out in the Democratic debate. We've talked about this for a while. They have criminalized coming across the border. They are separating parents from children. And this is what you get. They're scaring immigrants from picking up the kids. They want these images out there, I'm not convinced. But they do so with the misguided belief that parents who are afraid of their kids being murdered or raped in some of the most violent cities in the world, if that's where the kids have to go to be safe, that's what they'll do. So a couple of congresspeople went down there to tour the facility. Here's Ayanna Pressley. She is, understand right now, she was giving a press conference, and the congresspeople got surrounded by, I guess, people who were cheering on for abuse of immigrants. I don't know what you would call them. Counter-protesters?
Fascists, thugs, authoritarians, bigots, psychopaths.
She responds directly back to them.
Keep yelling. This is very appropriate. Vile rhetoric for vile actions. Hateful rhetoric for hateful behavior. Racist words and venom for racist policies. Very apropos. This is bigger than a funding debate or about any speeches that we give here on the floor of the House of Representatives. This is about the preservation of our humanity. And this is about seeing every single person there as a member of your own family. I am tired of the health and the safety, the humanity, and the full freedoms of black and brown children being negotiated and compromised and moderated. We need a system that works, that is humane, and that is compassionate, and that keeps families together. I learned a long time ago that when change happens, it's either because people see the light or they feel the fire. Today we are lifting up these stories in the hopes that you will see the light. And if you don't, we will bring the fire.
That's pretty powerful stuff.
She's exactly right.
Apparently, down there, it's being reported that by New York Times national correspondent Simon Romero, that Rashida Tlaib was there, and a Trump heckler was yelling, "We don't want Muslims here either. We don't care about Sharia law. We care about Jesus Christ. Go care about your own country." Apparently, there's some more video of that. Do we have a video of the of some of those protesters yelling there? I mean, good for these. Frankly, I'm not sure why it's taken this long. If you recall, the first time that somebody basically got up in front of one of these facilities was Jeff Merkley. Senator Jeff Merkley went down there months and months ago now.
Hey, are you going to tell the truth or have a photo op? Is it just a photo op? Is it the new empty parking lot? You know nothing of our people. That's all you do. Go away. Go away.
Taxation of funds.
Taxation is theft. They're yelling. Thanks for that.
Hey, do something about the wall, Ocasio, you piece of shit! You piece of shit! Piece of shit, Ocasio! Do something about the border! Do your job! Do your job, Ocasio, you piece of shit! Do your job!
There you go. So, nice.
I mean, yeah, I was reminded reading this weekend of how like all of this stuff was brewing for years, particularly in Arizona, and these groups of people going out and doing stuff that we still regularly see, like pouring out water bottles that were left for migrants,
right,
as an example. And then that kind of fusing with this conspiracy theory culture and a strategic shift for the Republican Party to not even pretend, right? Like that was the autopsy after 2012. Should we pretend to not be bigots?
Right. And they decided more effective to just be authentically bigoted. We will get to Professor Eberhardt in just a moment. It's an interview I recorded with her, I guess it was about a month ago now, which seems like ages ago. But want to remind you, we all want a haven, a place that feels uniquely you or us. With Joybird, you get one-of-a-kind furniture crafted after your own unique taste. You can turn your ideas into reality with hundreds of styles and options. They have all sorts of different choices you can make here. Rich buttery leather or the plushest velvet you've ever felt. You want a sofa in aquatic blue? A love seat in bubblegum pink? They got it. If you dream it, Joybird can make it a reality. They even have a beautiful selection of outdoor sofas, lounge chairs, and tables. Plus, their free personal design consultants can help you nail down your own design. Joybird offers a range of kid and pet-friendly upholstery options so that your creations can stand the test of time. I wish. Both my kids are out of that zone now. So mostly out of that zone. Joybird also offers a range. Best of all, thanks to their 365-day home trial. If you don't love your Joybird, you can return it for a full refund. See how Joybird can help you design your dream space. Find your joy today at joybird.com/majority. You can create the furniture that brings you joy. Joybird.com/majority. Go over there now. Check out the stuff. You won't believe the choices that you have. Their ability to custom all these things. You can receive an exclusive offer of 25% off your first order by using the code MAJORITY. So that's joybird.com/majority. Use the code MAJORITY for 25% off. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking to Jennifer Eberhardt, the author of Biased. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of Psychology at Stanford University, winner of the 2014 MacArthur Genius Grant, and author of Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Jennifer Eberhardt, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start with the notion of implicit bias. What do you mean by that?
Well, implicit bias or unconscious bias is something that we're all vulnerable to. And in my book, I'm trying to really show the science behind it. And it's basically our beliefs and our feelings that we have about social groups that can influence our decision making and our actions, even when we're not aware of it.
So when we say someone has implicit bias against black people, how is that different in your sense than racism, or is that a specific type of racism?
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
Well, when we talk about implicit bias, how is that different from racism, or is it simply a different type of racism?
Oh, I see. So I think when people think about racism, they're thinking about, people who are filled with hate and, people who are kind of like old-fashioned racists, what we would call them. And but here with this kind of implicit bias or unconscious bias, you don't really have to be a bigot to be biased. You can have bias that's triggered and can have real negative impact despite, our intentions and despite our desire to be fair.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about some of the impetus for some of your work. I mean, both of it, you mentioned both your experience as a child and your child's experience when he was quite young. Why don't we start with your child? You start the book when you were on a plane with, I think, your son, who was, I think, 5 at that time. Tell us about that event.
Yeah, so we were on an airplane flying back to California together, and he's excited to be on the plane, and he looks all around, and he's kind of checking the people out, and he sees a man there, and he says, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the guy, and he doesn't look anything at all like my husband. And so that led me to start looking around on the plane, and I realized he was the only black man on the plane. And so I am about to have a conversation, right, with my son about how not all black people look alike. And before I could have that conversation, though, he looks up at me and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And so I'm like, what do you mean? Daddy wouldn't rob a plane. And he says, "Yeah, I know." And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And he said, "Well, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that." So this is a good example of someone who is kind of picking up, things from the world around him and picking up this association basically between blackness and crime that he doesn't know where he got it from. But somehow he's been exposed to it and he's acting on it.
What is your sense of where your son could have picked that up? I mean, I have a 6-year-old, and this was, I guess, a decade or so more. But where would that form? I mean, was that a function of his association? I mean, is it your sense that was a sense of his association with blackness, or was it his sense of, or what?
Well, I think it's a function of kind of being in the world where, you hear about, you kind of, as a child, you're learning about people's position in society and sort of, what kinds of beliefs that you have about certain social groups. And as a child, you're trying to figure out, right, what correlates with what. He's trying to sort of think about how people maybe react to African American men in public spaces, and whether they give them a lot of room, whether they lock their car doors, all of those kinds of things. Children kind of pick up from us what we feel and how they should then feel and think about other people. So that's one way. I think the media is another way. I mean, there's a lot of ways, but that's one way.
And let's also talk about, since we're in sort of the realm of childhood, is your experience in switching schools. I guess it was elementary school or junior high, and which you ultimately became, I guess, maybe in some ways, inspiration for some of your work.
Yeah, so I grew up in an all-black neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, and my parents announced one day that we were going to move to a suburb of Cleveland called Beechwood, which at the time was almost all white. And so I was worried about making that move and how I would be accepted and whether I would have friends, whether I would feel like I could belong there, all those things. And when I actually did move, I found that the students were really friendly. They were really welcoming. They wanted to show me around and all of that. But I still had problems making friends. And that had to do with the fact that I could not tell their faces apart. I wasn't exposed to white people very much then, and I lived in this neighborhood again that was entirely black. So all of my sort of most meaningful interactions and relationships that I formed were with other black people, and so it was hard for me to actually, to be able to recognize their faces. It was, and it shocked me because I didn't anticipate, this at all. I never had that kind of problem before, but here I was, trying to make friends, and I couldn't tell one person from the other, and it actually took me some time to figure it out. Over time, I was able to figure it out, but my brain, needed time to adjust to the new environment and to the new demands that I was, that were placed on me in that new environment. And so, over time, I was able to, develop that skill. But before then, I didn't have it.
And so, subsequent to that, obviously, you have. You've come across research and partaken in research that suggests that that phenomena is physiological.
Yeah, so we've done some research. So I collaborated with a number of memory specialists at Stanford, and we conducted a neuroimaging study to look at this very issue. What scientists call it is the other race effect, and it's basically that people are much better at recognizing faces of their own race than faces of other races. And we wanted to understand the neural underpinnings of that effect. And so we put people in a neuroimaging scanner, both black and white study participants, and we showed them images of black and white faces. And we looked at what happened, in their brain as they were shown these images. And there's an area of the brain called the fusiform face area, and that's highly implicated in face processing. And so we were really focused on that area, and we found that that area was much more activated to faces of their own race than to faces of other races.
Now, is that strictly a biological development? I mean, what can that be? Can that be impacted based upon where someone like if we were to take an image of your brain prior to switching schools and an image of your brain 2 years later, would your ability to react to faces of a different race have changed, or would that dynamic still be there and you would have developed other sort of mechanisms to make up for the reduced brain activity?
That's a great question. So I would guess that my brain would have changed over that time, that this area, this fusiform face area, would become more responsive to faces outside of my own race. And we have some research on that, too, actually, where we looked at this process developmentally. And we found that for people who actually stay, in their own, in these neighborhoods that are racially segregated, they initially you're showing, some responsiveness to all faces, and then as you get older, you start to see a differential response to faces of your own race versus another race, and then as an adult, you see that effect that's even stronger. So it's not just our biology or our brain wiring, but our brain wiring is a function of our social environment. So if we change our social environment and we change who we're exposed to, then we can also change how our brain is functioning.
That's pretty nuts in a way. I mean that makes sense to me. But that's because theoretically, right? Like, just to continue to use you as a child in that scenario, your brain could have changed, 2 years later, and so you can recognize and differentiate, and your brain can register that you can differentiate between white people.
Right.
But theoretically, right, you could then move to a different school where it is predominantly Asian, and then go through that process all over again. Yes, or does
yes.
so?
Yes,
is it?
That's right.
Okay, so it's tied to sort of difference in races that in races in particular, as opposed to just like you don't have a certain muscle, for lack of a better a term, in your brain. Like that muscle is not generic. It is something that is learned, and you can see a change in your brain that is specific to specific races.
Right. You can see a change in your brain that actually specific to specific races. If you're not exposed to faces of that other race at all, you get less activation in that area of the fusiform face area. But as you're exposed to those faces more and more over time, your brain adjusts. So the finding was really about neuroplasticity. So just because we see, a difference in how the brain is responding or what gets activated doesn't mean that that's a permanent difference. That it's actually, the brain can kind of change based on, who we're interacting with and what our social environment is like.
And I mean, I don't want to get too stuck on this, but I find this part really fascinating. Is there also a coincident effect in terms of, I would imagine if you go into a room and you can't differentiate people in the same way that you could, in a different room, let's say, that would create a certain amount of anxiety. And the more stuff that's in there that is not just foreign, but foreign in the sense that you don't even have a capacity to process it in the same way. Right. I would imagine that creates all sorts of sort of subsequent social reactions.
Right. I mean, it does. I mean, so for example, you may not want to associate with those people as much because it's, leading to this anxiety. You're worried about making a mistake where you're confusing one person, for the other. And so, yes, it could have all of these other downstream consequences. In my case, I actually needed to be able to, to differentiate among white faces because, that was my new community, right? So I needed to be able to figure it out. And over time, I was able to figure it out. But even, I was super motivated, right, to do this, but I couldn't do that right away. It took my brain sort of time to, and enough exposure to these faces over and over again before I got the hang of it.
Okay, and so let's talk about a couple other examples of this implicit bias that you have established through some of the studies that you have done, and then I just want to come back around to questions that may be slightly outside your portfolio, but that your work obviously has implications of. But let's talk just a little bit about you did one experiment with, or I should say, study with subliminal words that were flashed in front of police officers, and then associated with faces. Just walk us through that study and what the implications were.
So this was a study that we were interested in sort of getting police officers to think about violent crime, and we were interested in whether when they thought about violent crime, if that would lead them to focus their attention on black male faces. So for the study, we had them sit in front of a computer and we flashed words on the computer, and we flashed the words at such a rapid rate that they couldn't consciously detect them. And the words were either words that were associated with violent crime or not. So some of the participants got words that were all associated with violent crime, like arrest and apprehend and capture and shoot and those kinds of words. And then we had a control group that didn't get any of those words. And then we showed two faces on the computer screen simultaneously, and one was a black male face and the other was a white male face. And we were interested in which face they would look at, and it turned out that those officers who've been exposed to words that were, associated with violent crime, like capture and arrest and so forth, they moved their eyes away from the white face and onto the black face. So it was the black face capture their attention. And for us, this was a way of almost looking at racial profiling in the laboratory, because that's what profiling is about, right? Is when officers are on the lookout for violent crime. Does the racial category of the person matter at all for who they attend to and who they may stop and who they may search and so forth? And so this is a version of that, a stripped down version of that we tried in the laboratory with officers.
And that almost establishes, which I think, like I feel like you could take those same police officers and take them out for a drink, and within a half an hour or so, you could get a sense of what the results of that test might be. But that would that establish, sort of from a clinical perspective? Tell us about this notion of categorical knowledge, because this is basically like the brain. I get the sense that the description is the brain just can't handle stuff as much. Chaos on some level, and so it has to divvy stuff up, and this is the way that chips fall.
Yes, that's exactly right. So categorization is a tool that our brain uses to kind of make sense of everything that we're bombarded with in the world. And so we need a way. We can't take in everything at once, and so we need a way to sort through it and to package it and to to categorize it so that we're able to establish some kind of control, over the world, but also some coherence. And so this is one tool that we use, and we categorize, not just people, but we categorize everything, right? We categorize furniture and cars, and, we categorize, flowers and you name it, dogs and cats and so forth. And so that helps us to, it establishes some kind of order, I guess, over what we're seeing, and allows us to, to be able to form expectations and so forth. But when we do this with people, when we categorize people, those social groups, then we also might develop beliefs about the people who are in that category, and we call those belief stereotypes. And we also may develop feelings about people in that category, which we call prejudice. And the stereotypes and that prejudice together is what we call bias. And the concern is that for people, that bias can influence how we treat them. It can influence how we make decisions about them and so forth.
So, it sounds like, and we should say there was another study where it was almost the reverse of the one you just explained, where you would see, where you showed subjects images of black faces and white faces, and then had other images sort of come into focus slowly. And
right.
Just explain that, because then I just want to I want to go further with this point of what sounds like we have a physiological predisposition to stereotyping. But before you address that, just tell us about that other study.
Yeah, so with the other study, what we did is we had people sit in front of a computer screen, and then we exposed them to a series of faces. So some of the participants got a series of black male faces, and others got a series of white male faces. Now, these faces were coming on the screen at such a rapid rate that they couldn't consciously perceive them, and so it just seemed like there were flickers of light that they were watching. And then after that, we had them perform what we call an object recognition task, and for that object recognition task, we saw an object appear on the screen, and it was really, really blurry at first, and then slowly in 41 steps or 41 frames, the object became more clear. And the participants' goal was to simply tell us at what point they could recognize the object. And we found that if they had been exposed to the black male faces beforehand, they were able to recognize the crime-relevant objects a lot faster. So if they saw a blurry image of a gun, say, they were able to recognize that gun really quickly. Whereas if they were exposed to white male faces beforehand, they needed more information, they needed more frames or more clarity before they could see that was a gun.
Was that was there a disparity between the race of the subject at all in terms of making those assessments?
No, not at all. So this is one of the things that arguments we make here, that it's not, sort of a bias isn't something that one group holds and the other doesn't. I mean, this bias, I think, is something that we're all, we're kind of vulnerable to because there's an association between blackness and crime that's out there in our society, and it's out there for a variety of reasons, but we're all picking up on it. And the argument here is that association between blackness and crime is so strong that it can influence not only how we see people, but it can influence how we see objects. And in this case, these were these crime objects like guns and knives and so forth.
But how does that, I mean, so there is something in society, right? And maybe it's an amalgamation of things, right? Like television, news, right. Culture, whatever, that associates black males with crime. But right. but if I'm living if I'm living in like a white enclave, and I'm going and almost everyone I deal with is white, and I have no or limited exposure to black people, and so I have no even real world experiences that push back on that one-to-one association, as it were, right? Versus I'm black and my family is black, and I know I have a lot of association with the idea that black males are not criminals. How does that not implicate that subconscious? Like, what is it? What is there is there something out there that has like precedence in terms of the way that it influences our subconscious that even overrides our own personal experiences?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. So there is some literature in psychology suggesting that contact really matters, right? So especially if you have positive contact, like the contact that you just described, I think that matters, in terms of how people, treat one another, and, how, so it lessens discrimination, basically, and it can also decrease sort of negative racial attitudes towards the other group and so forth, or even towards your own group, if there's a societal sort of attitude that's negative about your own group, right, that they can buffer you to some extent. But with these studies, we were just looking at whether there was an association there at all. But and it's an association again where it's not something that's conscious. So you couldn't decide, okay, I'm going to override this thing because I know it's not true, and I know that I have all of these other interactions with people in these positive ways that tell me that it's not true. It's hard to, even if you have that experience, you also have this other pretty powerful experience, at least in this country, that associates blackness with crime. And so it's hard to just completely undo the association, even though you might be at a conscious level, when you know that association is triggered, you might be able to stop it from influencing, what decisions you make or what actions you take.
So even contact does not because if there's no differential between race as they go through that study, that contact doesn't mitigate your subconscious beliefs at all. It mitigates only how those subconscious beliefs can be overridden in the context of the way you behave, but it's still within your subconscious in the same way.
Yeah, for some things, I think for some associations, for some stereotypic associations that are really strong, I think that is the case. But I don't want to suggest that contact doesn't matter, at all. I think, sometimes it does. Sometimes and then also if you pair that with all kinds of other things that you can do to mitigate bias, I think it's the combination of all these things working together that can, that can decrease bias to some extent. So you not only need contact, for example, but you also, need to be able to make decisions where you're not making decisions really quickly, and where you have to fall back on these automatic associations that have built up over time, but you have time to think it through and to, replace those associations with, with other things that you know about that may be contrary, right to those associations. So go ahead.
Well, there's a study that you cite about orchestras that were able to overcome gender bias by basically having them do, audition behind a screen or something, so that you couldn't tell the gender of the player, and that mitigated disparities in the way that orchestras were built. Well, so let me ask you this: I mean, if so, we have this. Is it possible to isolate what specifically is creating these associations? I mean, because these are ones, that we're talking just in terms of the way that they implicate the subconscious, but that's pretty crazy that contact might be able to mitigate the way that we react to our subconscious. But if I understand the study correctly, and what you're saying is that the subconscious is not necessarily, it can be mitigated, but it can't be directly impacted or shaped by contact in the way that sort of other authoritative messages are. What do we know what those authoritative messages, where they come from?
Well, I mean, we talked about some of them earlier. I mean, I think just, being out in the world and you see how people are reacted to in a different way, and maybe you yourself feel more fear when you see a black man approaching than if you see a white man approaching. You also are consuming news, right? Either through, online or the television or even local news, and you hear reports that that are associating blackness with crime, or even your understanding of real world statistics, crime statistics. So we talk about mass incarceration, for example, and just hearing the statistics about the proportion of the prison population that's black versus white versus Asian and so forth. Like, just knowing those facts can lead people to think, oh, okay, well, this means that this category of people, these are people who are inherently criminal, especially in the U.S., I think, where, there's not a lot of context for, how it is that we, how these disparities in criminal justice have developed over time. Like, we don't have the average person doesn't, have a sense of what the policies are that created those disparities and so forth. And so when you see a disparity, you just think, oh, okay, these are the people who made bad choices and they decided to be criminal, and so they were locked up. So you see what I'm saying? So there are a lot of
there are a lot of things that set this in motion.
This association.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So at what point does implicit bias turn into racism in the way that you view these sort of like this hierarchy? I mean, there's racism involved in creating the implicit bias, right? Which is setting up a system where there would be disparities in the way that we imprison people or the way that we police people. There's racism that implicates racial bias. I mean, just in the sense of like, I would imagine, like, on this level of like, black people were enslaved. That, I consciously am aware that shouldn't happen. But on some level, if like they allowed themselves to be slaves, maybe, like that may have created some type of, unconscious bias in people. But or
just seeing people as enslaved, right? I mean, just being exposed to that if you lived during that time.
Right.
And this is all new. You only saw people in these kinds of positions, and it was completely aligned with race. Even if you thought that this wasn't fair or this shouldn't be the case, you're still exposed to it, and that can start to affect you. That can start to affect you at this level that this level that we're talking about, where they can even affect your unconscious associations of blackness with servitude or blackness and slavery or blackness and inferiority and so forth.
And presumably it would go the other way too, where seeing a black person as president would impact your subconscious on some level in terms of like, okay, black people can be president, that type of thing, right? I mean, presumably that would have some impact as well. But at what point does that implicit bias turn into racism? I mean, is it just how you act upon those biases? Or is it, I mean, because I've talked to people who are, whose understanding of racism is less, from a clinical perspective, but more from like a philosophical perspective. And there is just a notion of, or maybe even sort of broadly sociological, there's a notion of white supremacy that we all subscribe to in this society, black and white, and we make decisions in our life. Like, at what point is this notion of white supremacy not the I'm burning a cross, I'm wearing a hood type of white supremacy, but like I want to live in this neighborhood because it's just a better neighborhood, and I don't like. At what point does not paying attention to these implicit biases constitute racism in your mind? Like, I am vaguely aware of like this disparity of thought, but I'm just not going to address it. Like, like I'm just choosing the best neighborhood I can for my kid. But on some level, I'm not, my heartstrings, let's just say, for lack of a better way of expressing it, are not pulled by the plight of these people over here. Whereas if they were white, maybe they would impact me a little bit more. Like, at what point, and maybe this is, sort of outside your portfolio, but at what point does
Go on, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious, at what point, from your perspective, have we crossed a certain threshold?
Right. I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, really what we're talking about with this implicit bias or this unconscious bias is sort of acting on stereotypes or your beliefs, or acting on feelings without really being aware that that's what you're doing. But that's separate from the impact that can have. So you can have bias that has a pretty devastating impact, whether it's conscious bias and I'm burning a cross, or it's this kind of bias that you were talking about where you just decide, you like this neighborhood better than this other neighborhood, and you're not aware, of the role that bias is playing in that decision making. So you could still, both kinds of biases can lead to pretty devastating outcomes, which is why we care about the implicit bias. I mean, we care about the unconscious bias. It's not, even though it's more subtle than the cross burning, it can have effects that are equally damaging as this more conscious thing that you're deciding that you don't like these people and you're going to act on it.
So, all right. So, lastly, I mean, I've interviewed folks who have said that the presidency of Barack Obama and the subsequent presidency of Donald Trump and his campaign sort of racialized a lot of areas in a way that were surprisingly to me not as racialized before that, and at least in modern history, in terms of like certain political issues and whatnot. How much? Why is it that this implicit bias, which exists, across races and presumably, across various people, white people, why is it that some people got what is it that makes this implicit bias, I guess, susceptible to being more activated or more predominant in the worldview of people? Like, my sense is that things have become much more racialized in many respects, and maybe, and I think the data shows that. Presumably, this racial bias has not really been impacted dramatically. What is it that sort of gives more life to this implicit bias?
I think one of the things that gives a lot more life to it is the social norms shifting. The bias is very responsive to the social norms that we live under. And so to the extent, say, that we have egalitarian values, and this is something that's near and dear to us, say, as Americans, and this is something that we want to strive, towards, if we're feeling that way, we're trying to, act in ways that are accordant with those values, even if we have, this implicit bias or these sort of unconscious, like, associations that we're making. We're trying to, at least outwardly, we're trying to battle that, right? We're trying to kind of live up to the standard that we have. But once those social norms start to, erode and shift, then it can also shift the correlation that we see between, implicit bias and this more explicit, like racism, if you want to call it that. So the norms matter, and our leaders matter a lot for that. They kind of set the tone for what's permissible behavior and what's not. And so as that comes under fire, or that's being questioned, then it can move us in the direction of being more biased, and we have more situations under which it's okay now to be biased, or if we're and even people who really hold these egalitarian values, they cherish those values, and it's important to them to behave in accordance with that. For those people, as the social norms shift away from that their behavior can start to change too. They get pulled in that direction too, because we're all social beings, and so we're responding to the social environment around us, and so that's why I feel like that the norms shifting can make a huge difference.
The book is biased.
To everybody.
The book is Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Professor Jennifer Eberhardt. We will put a link to the book at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Fascinating stuff.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, folks, that is the fun half for the program. I mean, that last response, the last answer she gave there, I think is so such an important part of the era that we're living in. When we go to the fun half, we're going to talk about this Facebook group. There are 20,000 custom Border Patrol agents in the country.
That's the denominator.
Well, now hold on. That's right. That is the denominator. We don't know what the numerator is. We know there was 9,500 people in this Facebook group. I would be
active and former,
but we don't know much about these people at all. We know ProPublica has identified 3 or 4 active border agents, one that's a supervisor. We don't know how many there are, but I mean, how many there have to be for it to make a difference? I mean, honestly, if 5% of an organization distributed between sort of leadership and non-leadership, if 5% of an organization is this corrupted by blatant racism and hatred of immigrants, I mean, how much influence do you think that could have throughout that organization, which is already dealing with, every problem they have at work is a function of, well, not every problem, but a large percentage of the problems they have at work has to do with immigration, right? And so there is at least a predisposition, and with an active, literally force of people trying to, who are demonizing these people. I mean, you can see how it corrupts an entire organization. And the fact that this group was set up in August of 2016 also, I think, is indicative of what the professor was saying in that last answer. There may be an implicit bias that exists in all of us towards other people. But when the nominee of a major political party, or pick any other type of, I guess, major public figure, although it would be hard to sort of even come up with an example of someone who has dominated the news more than Donald Trump over the past 3 or 4 years in any time in American history. The idea that he gave license to this, I think it's no coincidence this shows up in August of 2016. There's no other reason why it would have. Facebook has been around for a long time. Not decades. Anti-immigrant sentiment, to the extent that was there in 2016, theoretically was around. But I think there was just a broader license, and people would just, time to let my freak flag fly. And I think that's the story largely. It's definitely a big component of the election. There was, people were like, how could someone vote for Obama and then vote for Trump and be racist? Well, I mean, I think, we've spoken to many, many experts on how that's the case. But, and that racial animus, racial predispositions, racism plays a big part in that. Of course, that's a broad brush. We're not talking about every single person, but, and, this stuff gets normalized. When we go back, we will talk more about this Facebook group, but it's this last interview. I mean, it's a little bit different from ones that we generally do because it deals with psychology as opposed to sociology or politics. But this mix between sort of basic psychology and how it interacts with the broader context in the world, I think is rather important to the time that we're living in. And with that said, it's time to move to the fun half of the program. And a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. By becoming a member at jointhemajorityreport.com, you keep this show alive every single day. It is you people who do this. And we're doing all sorts of fun things coming up. We're going to go to Netroots Nation. We're heading down there to do a couple of interviews next week. I mean, not a couple. Probably do like 40, 20. I have no idea. Last year at Netroots Nation, I think interviewed Cynthia Nixon and Zephyr Teachout and Shockway Lumumba. Chukwe?
But I like what you said about that there'll be an intellectual resurgence, too, because I am starting to see a little bit of that.
Oh, my God. The myopia. Hey, listen. If somebody is aware that Dave Rubin is in town and he's on Twitter asking people to meet him at a wine bar, that is not the time to just tag me on Twitter. You call me.
Sam's subtweeting me right now.
You call me.
I saw this at 10:30 last night.
I don't care
insisting that
when
I
it
call
was.
him.
I would have
Brendan had the perfect tweet. He tweeted at both of us, and he said in Michael's Sam Cedar voice, "Hi," which is exactly the right way to let you know.
Well, that's fine, but then call me. I was alone with Saul,
Mile is at camp. And
Kids, you'll
would've-
be fine.
I would've-
Daddy's going uptown. Here's some string cheese. Do you see?
No, it's like,
Hi,
Saul,
Dave.
wake up. You're coming with Daddy. We've got to go somewhere. This is going to be important.
He's going to give you a juice box.
You'll
and we're
never,
gonna go humiliate him.
ever forget this night.
You watch your father humiliate a very stupid man, son. He's a very dumb man on the Upper West Side.
Saul, can you hold an iPhone and shoot this video, please? We need to post this on YouTube.
Son, can you say open exchange of ideas?
Right. Listen, now, we're going to live stream to Facebook. Now, listen, when you start to see all the little bubbles and hearts, that means that people are liking it, and I want you just to respond when you see those.
Hi.
But we're going down to Netroots
Hey,
Nation.
Dave.
I don't know how I got on that.
Hey, Dave.
We're going to be down at Netroots Nation and for a couple of days. And also, next week, if all goes right, maybe by midweek, we are going to launch something new. And it is, I don't know how many people listen to this point in the show, what percentage. So, we'll be talking about it at the top of the show more, but it is something that I've always wanted, which was just a very quick rundown of the headlines in the morning that I need to know, so I have a sense of what the tone of my day is going to be like, but also from a sort of a left-leaning perspective, sort of like the show, but more
it's like the
the
daily ding of news. For people who listen to that.
What's the Daily Ding?
Well, Daily Ding is behind a paywall now, but it was the Count the Dings network. It was just like the morning NBA roundup, and it would be like everything you needed to know in it, but also
Maybe
in
that's
a way.
what we call it, the Daily Ding. I don't care that there's one already.
Sure,
named it.
why
They're-
not?
They're behind a paywall.
But the other thing that's analogous about it is that it was like a great It wasn't just a straight summary. They still had, even though it was short and concise. They're there for their analysis.
Little
commentary.
attitude. We don't
so
have
there's
much.
a little bit
little,
of
little
there's a little
attitude.
flair,
Little attitude.
a little bit of flair. The
But
info you need with a little bit of flair.
right, and low bar to entry. It's going to be always very short. We're going for brevity in this instance. Little levity, mostly brevity.
Good morning, rebels.
Maybe we should
How come we
actually
didn't finish it. Oh, that has to be part of the
That's
opening
a lawsuit
package.
waiting to happen.
That is not a lawsuit. Why? Why can't we sample that?
He doesn't own the word rebels.
Good morning, Patriots. Good morning, rebels.
Maybe we'll include that type of stuff. I'm trying to do something
Just
that's
the old,
not too
do the old,
inside.
just slow it down or speed it up. Do the old Lec technique.
Well, there's no. We're not going to be. This will not be available on YouTube at first, anyways, and then ultimately, I think we will put a version up on YouTube. All right, folks.
Yeah,
so
he's busy. He's running for Congress. He's going to take out
Is
AOC.
he running for Congress?
I don't know. I thought that was what he's threatening.
What's he up to? Is he still around?
I thought he was going to challenge AOC.
I know the latest Brandon Straka update, and I haven't watched it yet, which is why I haven't brought it to anybody's attention. And it's literally because of the freaking YouTube algorithm. There are this very silly Vice series where they like to get let's have a group of black people to respond to the Democratic debate, but some of them will be MAGA. Right? They like that. This is this new sort of reality show Vice thing. So the new one is LGBTQ with MAGA. And there he is in the center row with this stupid hat on, which is actually, that's probably a dream come true for him.
Oh, yeah.
So
well, that was
but I haven't seen it yet.
That was
I don't know.
probably the whole game plan.
My guess would be is that it's a bunch of relatively normal people being like, what are you talking about?
What's wrong
he
with this
says
guy?
the same stuff that he said to you.
Good morning, rebels.
But it did look kind of promising, so maybe we'll have to dig through that. Maybe we'll have to apathetically steamroll through some of that content at some point.
So we're all of your membership will help us launch this little baby as well.
Join the MajorityReport.com. Also, don't forget JustCoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code Majority, get 10% off. Today is Tuesday, July 2nd, and that means that tonight is Tuesday, July 2nd.
Indeed.
Right, Michael?
Indeed. On tonight's show at 7 p.m. on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, we are discussing Reclaiming the Future, Technology and Marxism. Then Anthony Fontano of The Needle Drop comes on. We're talking about the 25-year anniversary of It Was Written and reggae. And then Malaika Jabali, Organizing for a Post-Capitalist Future, Gerrymandering, Vote Suppression, and Voter Turnout, and Biden and Harris. And then a post-game dealing with the 10-year anniversary of the coup in Honduras, new interview with Manuel Zelaya, of course, the debunk, bunch of other content. Patreon.com/TMBS, Michael Brooks Show on YouTube, where we're well over 53,000 subscribers now. So we're starting to kind of cook there.
And don't forget, check out the Antifada at patreon.com/the Antifada. Jamie is at commie camp right now at an undisclosed, got to have some OPSEC.
Dennis Prager at Commie Camp.
As for the literary hangover, the most recent episode is on a satire of the original utopian socialists in America, The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Coming up next is going to be a contemporary utopian. I wouldn't call him a socialist, but sort of a liberal leftist. Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists. He's been on this show. Me and my friend Chris are going to talk about his 15-hour work week proposals, his abolish poverty stuff, and most consequentially, his UBI. And we'll also take some shots at the Yang Gang in that podcast as well. So look forward to that in the coming, maybe this weekend, possibly next weekend.
We just got tweeted a piece by, I forget his name, the co-author of The People's Republic of Walmart.
Hal Rosworski?
Yes, who's really brilliant. And he wrote a piece 3 years ago, apparently echoing everything we said about UBI. Two different versions.
Who did?
The co-author of The People's Republic.
Michal Rosworski. We've interviewed him a couple
co-author
times.
of People's Republic of Walmart.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward critique of UBI. It's a political critique.
And it's an unfair one. Stop smearing Andrew Yang. Have him on the show. Why don't you?
Do you really think he would attack people with disabilities?
He would attack people with disabilities. That's a smear. Meanwhile, he's thinking about robotics while you're stuck in the past. Automation's got a kid. Your robot's going to take your podcast. And your hand's going to be in your dick while you're looking at J flag. Meanwhile, he's thinking about solutions. Answer me.
And you got to
explain why he's bad to poor people. Answer me now.
See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boys back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you can imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boys back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Almost says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
I am a total cunt.
Can we bring back DJ Dannerky's song, please?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Dannerky.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break for people.
That's fucking nonsense.
Hey, folks, a fucking reminder.
I do not have Parkinson's.
And the alpha males are
psych. Fuck 'em.
Almost says what?
Almost
says what?
Hell of a lot of bank. 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 Hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy!
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are back. Africans are black.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total
pussy.